She was only 16 when her uncle dragged her by the arm, her face pale and streaked with tears, to stand before the man who could have been her grandfather. His beard was long and gray, his shoulders bent with age, but his eyes gleamed with the pride of a man who had just acquired property. She was not a bride to him, not a companion or partner, but an ornament, a mark of his power, and a way to show the town that even the poorest bloodline could be tied to his wealth. Her protests were swallowed in silence. The small community where she lived did not care for her wishes. To them, she was another mouth that had been too heavy for her uncle to feed. Now she would be the old man's responsibility. Some neighbors whispered in pity, others smirked in envy, but no one lifted a hand to stop it. The ceremony was quick, a binding of vows that felt more like shackles than a union. She stood stiffly, clutching her trembling hands together as the man who could barely stand without his cane claimed her as his wife. The house she entered after the wedding was large but suffocating. Its halls echoed with emptiness, and the windows were shuttered as though to trap her inside. She spent her first nights crying into the pillows, muffling her sobs so that no servant could hear. The man she had been given to hardly spoke to her at first, only barking orders or gesturing when he needed something. His presence loomed over her like a storm, and she wondered how many years she would waste in that shadow before she withered away like the roses that had been left untended in the courtyard. But something began to shift in the silence of those days. She discovered that the man, though rigid and proud in front of others, was frail and weary when no one was watching. His hands shook when he held his cup, his breath wheezed when he climbed the stairs, and he winced each morning as though simply waking brought pain. She saw his weakness, and in that weakness, she found her own strength. She began to care for him, not out of love but out of a strange defiance, as if showing kindness in a place where she had been denied it was the only power she had. At first he resisted. He shouted when she tried to help him walk, snarled when she laid a hand on his arm. But his anger had no bite, and her calm persistence began to break through the armor he had built around himself. One night, when he thought she was asleep, she heard him whisper a prayer, something about forgiveness, something about loneliness. It startled her, because she had never thought of him as a man capable of guilt. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. She grew stronger, her spirit no longer bent beneath the weight of fear. He grew softer, speaking more gently, even asking her opinion on matters in the household. The villagers who once pitied her now stared in confusion when they saw her walking beside him with her head held high, not as a prisoner but as someone who had found an unexpected voice. No one could explain the change. Some said she had bewitched him. Others said he had been struck by an illness that humbled him. But the truth was simpler. She had given him something he had never earned, compassion. And in return, he gave her something she never thought possible, freedom within captivity. When he finally grew too weak to rise from bed, it was her hand he reached for, her face he searched with trembling eyes. "I thought I was buying youth to comfort my old age," he confessed with a broken whisper. "But instead, God sent me a mirror of my shame, and a chance to leave this world better than I entered it." The girl who had been dragged into his home against her will no longer felt like a victim. She had discovered strength in the unlikeliest place, in the cracks of a man everyone thought beyond redemption. And when the day came that the bells tolled for his passing, the same villagers who once pitied her now looked at her with awe, because the girl they thought broken had walked through fire and come out with a spirit no one could chain. The morning after the bells tolled for his death, she woke not to the sound of his voice or the weight of his presence, but to a silence so thick it seemed to press against her chest. The house felt enormous, hollow, and filled with the shadows of everything that had happened within its walls. She was only 17 now, though the months she had lived under that roof had carved years into her soul. She sat up on the edge of the bed, her thin fingers twisting the hem of her nightgown, wondering what came next. Widow. That was the word they would give her now. A widow before she had even learned what it meant to truly be a wife. The villagers whispered again, just as they had whispered when she was first married. Some pitied her, saying she had been robbed of youth, first by being tied to a man older than her father, and now by being left with no clear place in the world. Others spoke with envy, assuming that wealth had passed into her hands, that the grand house in the land would now be hers. But none of them knew the truth. The will he left behind was not simple. The man who had once lived only for himself had written with trembling hands that his possessions should pass into the stewardship of the girl he had once treated as nothing more than property. It was his last attempt to make peace with his soul, leaving her not only freedom, but power. Yet power frightened her. She had never sought it, never dreamed of wealth or authority. What she had craved was dignity, and in the months leading up to his death, she had found some portion of it within herself. Now the servants bowed when she entered a room, the neighbors eyed her with a mix of respect and suspicion, and her uncle, who had sold her off as though she were cattle, suddenly returned, knocking at her door with wide smiles and false kindness. "Child," he said, trying to soften his voice into something it had never been before, "you must come back home. You're far too young to manage this estate. Let me help you. Let me guide you." But she saw the hunger in his eyes, the greed that glimmered like a vulture circling over what it thought was prey. Once, his voice might have cowed her, made her shrink into silence, but not anymore. She stood tall, her hands clasped behind her back, and said only, "This house is mine now. My life is mine now. You gave me away once, you will not take me back." He sputtered, anger breaking through his mask of gentleness, but the doors closed on him before he could press further. That night she wept, not out of weakness, but out of the strange weight of having stood her ground. It terrified her how much she had changed. The girl who used to hide in corners now met men's eyes without lowering her head. The girl who used to tremble at commands now gave them with quiet certainty. Her days filled quickly with tasks she had never been trained for. She learned to manage accounts, to speak with merchants, to listen to the laborers who worked the land. She surprised them all with her fairness, her willingness to listen, and her refusal to be deceived. The first time a merchant tried to cheat her, offering rotten grain at the price of fresh, she let him speak, let him spin his lies, and then cut him down with a single sentence that revealed she had studied the trade books late into the night. He left red-faced, muttering, and never returned. The townspeople began to watch her more closely. Some said she had been hardened by her strange marriage, others whispered that the old man's ghost guided her hand. But the truth was simpler. She had decided that her life would never again be dictated by others. She had been forced into a bond she did not want, yet from its ashes she had risen stronger. Still, nights were the hardest. The silence of the house crept into her bones. She had grown used to tending the frail man in his final days, used to sitting by his bedside, listening to his labored breath. Now the emptiness pressed down on her, and though she hated to admit it, she missed the rhythm of caring for someone. She had not loved him, not in the way a young girl might dream of loving, but she had cared in her own way. In his final moments, he had leaned on her not as a master leaning on a servant, but as a man leaning on another soul. That memory haunted her, because it was both painful and strangely precious. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon and painted the fields in gold, a knock echoed at the door. She opened it herself, no longer afraid to meet whoever stood on the other side. A young man stood there, broad-shouldered, sun-browned, with eyes that carried both strength and sorrow. He introduced himself as the old man's estranged son. The revelation struck her like a storm. She had never heard of him, never seen him mentioned, and yet here he was, flesh and blood, demanding to know what right she had to live in the house that should have been his. His voice trembled with anger, with betrayal, and though she stood as firmly as she could, her heart pounded with unease. "I am his widow," she said softly but clearly. "This house was given to me in his will. If you are his son, then your quarrel is not with me, but with the choices your father made." His face darkened, but something in her steady gaze unsettled him. He had expected weakness, perhaps tears or pleas, but not this calm resolve. He left that night without forcing his way, but she knew he would return. And he did. Again and again, at first with accusations, later with questions. He wanted to understand why his father had left him nothing, why a stranger, a girl, had been given everything. She told him the truth as best she could, that his father had been a man of pride, a man of mistakes, but in the end, he had sought redemption in the only way he knew. The son's anger slowly softened into grief. He had hated his father, abandoned him, and now, faced with death and a will that cut him off, he found no closure. In the quiet evenings, he began to linger after their arguments, speaking less of what he had lost and more of the years that had been wasted between them. And though she owed him nothing, she listened. Perhaps because she knew what it felt like to have life stolen, she gave him the one gift she could, her ear, her patience. Seasons turned. The fields bloomed and withered, the house filled with new life as she opened its doors to orphans and widows, determined to give others what she had once been denied. She did not become bitter, though she had every reason to. Instead, she became something no one expected, a pillar in the community, a girl-turned-woman whose scars became her strength. The old man's son continued to return, helping at first with small tasks, later with greater labors. The villagers watched in curiosity, some whispering that they would marry, others shaking their heads and saying it was impossible. She paid no attention to them. She had lived long enough with the chains of others' opinions. Her life was her own now, and if she chose to open her heart one day, it would be on her own terms. For now, she walked her path with dignity, a path that had begun in tears and chains but had led her into a place of quiet power. And though the world would never forget that she had once been the poor young girl forced to marry a man older than her father, they would also never forget what happened after, for no one had expected her to rise from the ashes of that fate and build a life stronger, freer, and more radiant than anyone had imagined. The years that followed became a tapestry of lessons, stitched with pain, resilience, and unexpected grace. The girl who had once been dragged like an offering to a man twice her grandfather's age grew into a woman whose name carried weight, not because of wealth or inheritance alone, but because of what she had endured and what she had become in spite of it. She did not allow bitterness to consume her. She refused to wear victimhood as a cloak. Instead, she let her scars breathe like open truths, not hidden, not shameful, but reminders of where she had come from. There were days when the loneliness cut deep. Nights when the silence of the old house mocked her, whispering reminders of everything that had been stolen from her youth. She would sit by the windows, staring at the moonlight spread across the fields, remembering the terrified girl she had been and wondering if she could ever feel whole. But every morning she rose, every task she completed, every life she touched became another act of defiance against the fate others had written for her. The orphans she took in began to call her mother, though she was barely more than a girl herself. She taught them not only how to read, to sow, to tend the land, but how to hold their heads high when the world tried to tell them they were less. Widows came to her doorstep, broken and lost, and she welcomed them, remembering what it felt like to have no one. Slowly, the house that had once been her prison became a refuge, its dark halls filled with laughter, its cold walls warmed by the lives she sheltered. The villagers who had once pitied her now looked at her with respect. Men who had scoffed at her too young marriage now bowed their heads when she passed. Women who had once whispered behind her back now sought her counsel, asking how she had borne so much and yet walked with dignity. She never claimed to have all the answers, but she spoke honestly, saying that pain had taught her strength, and strength had taught her compassion. The son of the old man continued to circle her life like a restless spirit, drawn not by what he could gain from her but by something deeper he could not name. At first he came with anger, then with questions, and finally with a quiet desire to simply be near. He watched the way she carried herself, the way she treated the children and the widows with a gentleness that was firm and steady. He saw in her the reflection of everything he had failed to be for his father, everything he had failed to be for himself. In time, their conversation softened. He spoke of regrets, she spoke of survival. He confessed his guilt over leaving his father to age in bitterness, and she, with the calm wisdom her short, scarred life had given her, told him that sometimes broken men do not know how to be fathers, and sometimes children must learn to forgive what cannot be repaired. Her words did not erase his pain, but they eased the weight of it, and in that easing, he began to heal. The world outside their small village shifted and changed. Wars came and went, crops failed and bloomed again, storms tore through fields, and yet her house stood as a beacon. People began to call it not the house of the old man, but her house. It was a place where the poor were fed, where the broken found rest, where those without family discovered belonging. She had been denied love in the way she first dreamed of it, but she had found another kind, a love that spread outward, that healed others, that gave her life purpose. When whispers rose again, suggesting that she should remarry, that she should not carry the burden of widowhood forever, she smiled but said little. She had learned not to let her life be dictated by others' tongues. Marriage, she knew, was not salvation. She had been forced into one that was meant to be her end, yet it had become her beginning. If love ever came to her again, it would not be because society demanded it, but because her heart chose freely, unbound and unbroken. In the quiet of her heart, she often thought of the old man. Not with bitterness anymore, nor with love, but with a kind of solemn gratitude. He had been both her captor and her teacher, her burden and her awakening. Through his frailty she had discovered her strength. Through his cruelty she had found her compassion. Through his death she had gained her freedom. He had tried to purchase youth to soothe his aging pride, but instead, he had left behind a legacy he never intended, the rebirth of a girl into a woman no one could shackle. As she aged, the lines of sorrow and strength etched themselves into her face, but her eyes never lost their fire. Children she had raised grew into adults who carried her lessons into the world, spreading seeds of resilience wherever they went. Widows who had once arrived at her door in despair left with dignity restored, speaking of her name with reverence. Even the son of the old man, once bitter and lost, grew into a man softened by her influence, bound to her not by law or inheritance but by loyalty and respect that surprised even him. And when the time came that her hair turned silver, when her steps slowed and her hands trembled like his once had, she sat in the same chair by the window where she had once mourned her youth and realized she no longer felt robbed. Life had taken much from her, but it had also given. It had given her strength born of suffering, compassion forged in injustice, dignity shaped by endurance, and a legacy that reached far beyond what anyone had expected of the poor girl once dragged into a marriage she never wanted. On her final evening, as the sun melted into the horizon and the air grew still, she sat surrounded by the children and grandchildren of those she had raised. Their voices filled the house with warmth, laughter echoing against the same walls that had once heard only her muffled cries. She closed her eyes, breathing in the sound of life, and a tear slipped down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of peace. For though her beginning had been marked by chains, her ending was written in freedom. Though she had once been silenced, her story had become a voice that would not be forgotten. And so, the girl who was once forced into the arms of a man older than her father, the girl no one expected to rise, ended her journey not as a victim, not even merely as a survivor, but as a woman who turned captivity into strength, shame into dignity, and despair into hope for generations yet to come.